The OpenVPN server started nicely, and now I need to create my client certificates and keys. I'm going to create the client certificates and keys in the OpenVPN server, and then I'll copy those client certificates and keys to the remote computer that we're going to use to tunnel into the server. Now to do this, first I need to be in the easy RSA folder, which I am. I'll do a pwd command to show you that I'm in root etc openvpn easy-rsa. If I do an ls command, you can see all the scripts that we use to create our certificates and keys. Now we're going to use the build-key script to build our client keys. But first I'm going to source the vars file, which has our variables. So I'll do a source./vars. And now I'll do a ./build-key and then give it the name of my client that I'm creating the keys for. If you're going to have multiple clients connecting or tunneling into your network through your OpenVPN server, the best practice is to build a separate set of client keys for each client. I'm going to name this set of keys my client 3. I've done this this is the third time I've done this, so that's why I'm naming the keys my client 3. All right, so build-key my client 3, I'll hit enter, and now I accept the variables. For the common name, you can see that my client 3 is loaded into the name. I'll just accept that, hit enter, and enter again, and a challenge password, p@ssw0rd is fine. An optional name, I'll hit enter, y, and enter, and then 1 out of 1 certificate request certified, commit, y, and enter, and it looks like it worked. Write out database with 1 new entries, database updated, so now we have the client keys. If I change directory into the keys folder and do an ls command, you can see that I have the myclient3.key and the myclient3.crt file, and so that's perfect. Now I need to copy my ca.crt file and my myclient.crt file and my myclient3.key file, these 3 files, over to a remote computer. To copy these files to another computer, I could copy them to a USB thumb drive, or I could email the files to myself, or I could use SFTP, SCP, and secure shell them to myself. Now I've decided to use FileZilla from my client computer to copy the 3 files from the server over to the client. But to do that, I'm going to need to move these 3 files first to a directory that does not require root access. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy ca.crt and myclient3.crt and myclient3.key, and I'm going to copy these 3 files over to root home student downloads. So I'll do that, and now I'll change directory and go over there. So home student downloads, and do an ls, and you can see there are the 3 files in my downloads directory. Now I should be able to FTP those over to the remote client. Now before I do that though, I want to point out one other thing. If I do an ls-l and we look at the permissions, you can see that the myclient3.key file, this is a private file. This is the private key. The myclient3.crt, that's the certificate, that's the public key essentially, or that's a public file. But the myclient3.key is private, and notice that the permissions make it read-write for the owner, but no permissions for the group or for the public. Now that's not going to work when I try to FTP it over. So what I need to do is change these permissions on this myclient3.key file. So what I'll do is I'll do a chmod 644 on my client3.key. And now if I do an ls-l, you can see that all three files have 644 permissions, or read, write, read, and read. So now I can go over to my remote computer and FTP or secure FTP these files over to the remote computer. Now I have the remote computer ready to go. I've got a VirtualBox image here of Linux Mint, and here's my Mint, and basically it's on the same network as my CentOS 7 server. The NIC on this Linux Mint virtual machine is in bridged mode, just like ETH0 on my CentOS 7 server's NIC is in bridged mode. So as you can see, I can ping the server 192.168.2.128. That's the IP address of the server at ETH0, and you can see I can communicate with the CentOS 7 server. So I've already installed FileZilla on this Linux Mint virtual machine, so I'll open up FileZilla and I'll put in that IP address. There we go, 192.168.2.128. Username is student, password is student, port we'll say 22, and do a quick connect, accept the certificate, click OK, and there we go. So I'll just scroll down here and double click on downloads, and there are the three files on the remote computer: ca.crt, myclient3.crt, and myclient3.key. And if we scroll over, the permissions are all good. So what I want to do is I want to copy it to a folder here on my Linux Mint machine. Now I created a folder just for that purpose called OpenVPN Client. So all I need to do is drag these over. I'll need to put in the password for permission, and there's the first file, and the second file, and the last file. So now I've copied all three files from the CentOS 7 server to my remote client that's separate from the server. This is a Linux Mint box running in VirtualBox. Okay, so now I have these files. I can close FileZilla, and what I'll do is, let's take a look. I'll change directory into the OpenVPN client folder and do an ls, and you can see there are my three files. These are the three files that I need to connect to the OpenVPN server. Now I'm not only going to need these three files, I'm also going to need a configuration file that has the configurations to connect to the server. Now to do that, I'm going to, let's see here, we'll touch a file here. So I'm going to touch, the file will be called myclient.ovpn. All right, so we'll do an ls. There it is, myclient.ovpn. Now I'll use nano to edit it. And this is the configuration file that we're going to use to connect to the OpenVPN server. So we need to put a few lines in here. So I'm going to put those in now. Let's see if I can make this a little bit bigger. Okay, so client dev ton, that'll be the tunnel adapter. This is going to be a proto, will be UDP. The remote host is at 192.168.2.128, and the port is 1194. That's for OpenVPN. It's going to be a tunnel situation, and or a ton interface rather, and then resolve dash retry infinite. I have just noticed an error in my configuration file. This should be auth-user-pass. Notice that I've got my ca.cert file in here, my myclient3.cert, and my myclient3.key file. I'll do a Control X, Y, and enter to save the file. Now if I do an ls, you'll see that I've got all of these certs and key, and I've got my key, and I've got my client.ovpn file. Now, if I don't have these three files here, my two certificates and my key file, then this configuration file won't work. So that's part of it. These settings right here are basically paths to those certificates and keys. And I need the correct IP address, of course, of the CentOS server and the correct port number. And all of these settings look pretty good. Now, before we can OpenVPN connect to a server, I'm going to go back to the server and I'm going to put a couple more settings in here that are important. I need to edit the root etc sysctl.conf file. Sysctl can be used to dynamically change kernel parameters, and I'm going to use it to turn the CentOS 7 server into a router. net.ipv4.ip_forward equals 1. I'll save that, Control X, Y, and enter. Now I can load that sysctl conf file, sysctl -p. Now we've come this far, we might as well add user account authentication and passwords for users that are connecting to our VPN tunnel. Now to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a module into the OpenVPN, and it's pretty cool. So I'll do a touch, and I'll create a file in etc pam.d, and the file will be called OpenVPN. Now I need to edit that file. So we'll edit that file, and we need to put in the following information in this file: auth tab required tab pam_unix.so. That's supposed to be an underscore there. Tab shadow tab no delay. On the next line, account required pam_unix.so. That looks good, so I'll do a Control X, Y, and enter. And now I need to edit, once again, the root etc OpenVPN server.conf file. I'm going to go all the way to the end of the file, and I'm going to add the following line: plugin and I'll exit and save. Also in the server.conf file, I'm going to go in there one more time, and I'm going to add a couple more lines. Right under this area right here, I'm going to add a route in here. So I'm going to add push, and then within quotation marks, route to 192.168.10.0 network, and the subnet mask. I'm doing this so that we can push a route to the inside LAN that's behind the CentOS 7 server, so that our tunneled users can communicate with the users on that inside facing LAN, the 10 network. Then I'll go down in the configuration file, And I'm going to uncomment this client to client, and this will allow clients to not only see the server, but they'll be able to communicate with each other if they're tunneled in. So I'll uncomment that. So that looks good. I'll exit and save. And now I'm done with all of my configurations. All I need to do now is do a systemctl and stop OpenVPN at server.service, and then I'll start it up again. And then I'll take a look at the status, and it should look good. All right, that is what I was hoping for. It looks like it's working quite nicely, and all we need to do is connect to our OpenVPN server. Okay, so now it's time to test out our OpenVPN configuration and see if we can tunnel in from the outside. Now, to do this test, I've also fired up another virtual machine. I've got another VMware virtual machine. It's a Windows XP Pro client. So here it is. And the NIC on this Windows XP Pro client is in LAN segment mode. So if I bring up my diagram, right now, this machine right here, this virtual machine, is my Windows XP Pro client. It's got a LAN segment NIC, so it's behind the CentOS 7 server. So this Windows XP Pro machine is on the 10 network, and its gateway is the CentOS 7 server at 10.1. So I can bring it up here, and you can see that its IP address is 192.168.10.100, and he can ping 192.168.10.1. So he's able to ping the CentOS 7 server. So I've got that client right here. Then I've got the VirtualBox virtual machine running Linux Mint out here, and it's got a bridged mode network adapter, so it's picking up an IP address off of my network, just like the ETH0 address on the CentOS 7 server. And so the goal is to see if we can VPN connect from this Linux Mint virtual machine into the CentOS 7 server. So to do that, I'll go into Linux Mint, and I'll run an ls command, and we need to go into this OpenVPN client folder, so that's where we'll go. I'll do another ls command, and there is my cert, my other cert, my key, and there is my OVPN configuration file. Now, to use OpenVPN, all we need to do is do a sudo OpenVPN. Now, I also need to mention that I've already installed OpenVPN into Linux Mint. So if you don't have OpenVPN in your client, you can install it using a yum install or an apt-get install OpenVPN. So sudo OpenVPN, and then the path to the client configuration file, so my client.ovpn, and I'll hit enter, and I get an error. Okay, so we look at the error, and it says that there is a missing parameters in the client OVPN file related to ca.crt. So let's take a quick look at it. And we'll take a look at this file, and I can see right off the bat that I've made a mistake here in my file. I need to have this say ca space ca.crt, and this is the cert space myclient3.crt, and this is the key. So we put key space myclient3.key. That looks good. CA, cert, and key. I'll do a Control X, Y, and enter. And now let's give it another try. Enter authentication username. So I need to have a username. Well, my user on my OpenVPN server is student, and the password is student, and looks like I'm connecting. And looks like the route was added and everything looks good. So now I will open up another terminal, since that terminal is being used by OpenVPN, and I'll do an ifconfig. And you can see I have a tunnel connection here, tun0, 10.8.0.6. I can probably ping the CentOS 7 server at 10.8.0.1, there it is, in the tunnel. Let's see if I can communicate with the 192.168.10 network. I'll ping 192.168.10.100, and you can see I can ping the Windows XP Pro client that's inside that network. So I have a successful tunnel, and I'm tunneled in, and everything looks pretty good. To quit, I go back to this terminal window here where I have OpenVPN tunnel connection running, and I do a Control-C, and that will quit and exit the OpenVPN. And if I do an ifconfig here, you'll see that the TUN0 interface is now down. Now another thing that I can do is I can go back to my CentOS 7 server and I can add a user. So I could say add user, we'll say Bob, and then I'll do a pass WD for Bob, and we'll put in the password here. I'll put in Bob12345 and Bob12345. So now I have a new user named Bob on my CentOS 7 server. Now I'll go back to VirtualBox and we'll see if we can connect in using him. So I'll clear this and we'll connect again. Username Bob, password Bob12345, and you can see that Bob is now connected. There we go. I can open up another window here, ifconfig, and there he is connected, tunnel 0. Now if I do a Control-C to kill this, right? I could also do, if I wanted, a pkill OpenVPN, and that would kill OpenVPN as well. Now let's try to see if we can connect with a user that does not have an account on the server. So I'll try to connect in again. This time I'll say Susie and password Susie, and you can see that authentication failed, and so I did not get a tunnel interface. We'll do an ifconfig here, and you can see there's no tunnel interface, did not authenticate correctly, and it looks like it's working quite nicely. I can tunnel in, I can communicate with the users on the LAN behind the server, and I need to have a user account and password enabled to do it. Of course, none of this is possible without the certificate of authority certificate, my client certificate, my client key, and a correct configuration file.